By the fall of 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Pacific Fleet commander, was anxious to move the road to Japan away from the slogging Big Island campaigns that General Douglas MacArthur was conducting up the Solomon's Ladder and across northern New Guinea. Determined to get away from those momentum-smothering big-unit jungle battles, Nimitz planned to launch an island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific, aimed at the smaller, more crucially decisive targets. He saw this route as the fastest way to sever the Japanese mainland from the resources of its conquered empire to the south. Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, was to be the first U.S. incursion into this new Central Pacific theater of war. Tarawa was the most important of the 16 atolls that made up the Gilberts, an island chain strung across the equator some 2,400 miles west of Hawaii. Of these, the target was Baishio, a tiny islet 2.5 miles long and a little more than a half-mile wide. Its 291 acres covered an area of less than half a square mile. Site of a nearly completed airfield, Baishio also contained 500 densely packed bunkers and strongpoints manned by 5,000 fanatical defenders. The Japanese had been fortifying Baishio for months. It contained more than 50 coastal defense, anti-aircraft, anti-boat, and beach defense guns. Many of the 5- and 8-inch batteries were in armored turrets. Man-made barriers included concrete tetrahedrons in the water, offshore mines, barbed wire, and thick barriers of sand, concrete, and coconut logs. The islet's pool table flatness gave attackers no place to hide. Baishio's garrison was largely Rikku Sentai, elite sailors, highly trained in both infantry and naval weapons and tactics. The deadliest defense could not be seen. It was a coral reef a half-mile out from what would be the landing beaches. Charts drawn in 1841 were still in use. There were reports of a dodging tide, during which depths over the reef were unpredictable. This danger to an amphibious operation was recognized and accepted. Few questioned the target.
Speed of execution in this campaign was critical. There were operational considerations and strategic ones. Operationally, they were guided by Nimitz's dictum, get the hell in and get the hell out. There's nothing more vulnerable in an amphibious assault than the cluster of transports and cargo ships at anchor around a landing site. And the other sense was, on the strategic level, the Marshall Islands were more valuable. They were the next step in the Central Pacific campaign. That date had already been set. There was no flexibility.
Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner would command the Tarawa amphibious forces for an overall invasion that would also include the capture of nearby Macon and Apamama, two less heavily defended islands. Turner's Marine counterpart was 5th Amphibious Corps Commander General Holland Howland Mad Smith, a quick-tempered leader and early advocate of beach assault training. Admiral Harry Hill ran the Amphibious Task Force, while General Julian Smith commanded the 2nd Marine Division. Smith's Marines had been given the job of hitting the Tarawa beaches. Half of his men were veterans of the battle at Guadalcanal, yet few had taken part in a contested amphibious assault. The supporting naval forces for the operation were formidable, but a critical mistake had already been made. Admiral Turner's flagship was the old battleship Maryland, raised from the mud at Pearl Harbor. Turner sailed with half of his electronic installation crews still struggling with the Maryland's crucial communications gear. The failure of these communications at the firing of the Maryland's first salvo would have grim and costly results. The battle began early on November 20th, 1943. Shortly after 5 a.m., Admiral Hill's naval guns began blasting Baishio Island. Assault Wave Marines climbed down to begin the trip to shore. Holland Smith had held the division's 6th Marines in reserve. The other two regiments, the 2nd and 8th, were to seize Baisio. With just over 6,000 Marines ready to assault the enemy's approximately 5,000 defenders, the odds were well beneath the 3-to-1 advantage desired when attacking a determined, deeply dug-in foe. Leading the assault forces was Colonel David Shoup, recently promoted when the commander of the 2nd Marines fell ill. As the Amtracs moved toward the Baisio shore, the naval and air preparation continued. The commander of the bombardment force said of Tarawa, "We do not intend to destroy it. Gentlemen, we will obliterate it."
What we hadn't figured, of course, was that this is the most heavily defended beach, yard by yard in the world. And there were an awful lot of Japanese there who were waiting for us. And very good soldiers, very good fighters they were.
The division's chief of staff, Colonel Merritt Edson, a hero of Guadalcanal, was less confident. He would later say, "Navy gunners make the mistake of thinking of shore targets as ships. When you hit it, it sinks and is gone. On land, you need direct hits on every gun." How right he would prove to be. Off Tarawa, the Invasion Day naval and air pounding continued. But the Americans had underestimated the Japanese skill in building massive, low-lying strongpoints that proved to be impervious to flat trajectory fire. What was needed were plunging, high-angle, armor-piercing shells with fuses to delay detonation. Even so, 3,000 tons of shells and bombs hit Baisio at a rate of 10 tons per acre. With the way cleared by 2 minesweepers, gunfire support ships followed a pulsing radar beacon into the 17-mile-long by 9-mile-wide lagoon. A strong westerly current took many of the Amtracs off course.
The 2nd Marine Division knew in advance that they would face a barrier reef at Tarawa. And they came up with an innovative idea of converting their logistic support tracked landing vehicles, LVTs or Amtracs or Alligators, various names, to use them in the assault waves to get over that reef and carry the troops to the beach. They bolted on cheap scrap iron to the sides of the cabs, and they put more machine guns on them. But there were only 75 of them. That was not enough. General Julian C. Smith, commanding the division, went up the chain of command. "We need more Amtracs. We know there are newer versions in San Diego. Get them to us." It took some doing. They got 50 more of these LVTs. They arrived the very morning of D-Day off Tarawa.
Admiral Hill wanted his destroyers close enough to the beach to use their 40 millimeters. The Navy expressed concerns about the thinness of the armor protecting the ships. Said Julian Smith, "Marines will be crossing that beach with bayonets. The only armor they'll have is a khaki shirt." Unfortunately, bombarding ships and Navy pilots relied on their watches instead of monitoring the distance of the invasion boats from the beach. The covering naval fire would lift with some of the Amtracs as much as 22 minutes from shore, giving the defenders too much time to recover from the barrage. Air attackers, untrained in amphibious ground support, proved initially lacking in coordination, accuracy, and effectiveness. There were to be 3 assault battalions crossing the reef and landing abreast on beaches designated Red 1, Red 2, and Red 3. At the center of the action was a 700-yard pier extending beyond the fringing coral reef. If not cleared of the enemy before the Marines landed, it would be the source of crushing crossfire. The job of going in first and neutralizing the pier was given to a 37-man scout sniper platoon led by a former Guadalcanal sergeant. Before he was killed, William Dean Hawkins would not only clear the pier, but lead his men in destroying bunker after bunker to cover the landing forces. For his heroism, Lieutenant Hawkins received a posthumous Medal of Honor.
And Shoup, who himself won a Medal of Honor and the only living recipient of the Medal of Honor for Tarawa, said, "It's not often that you can credit a first lieutenant with winning a battle, but Hawkins came the closest to it of anybody here."
The Amtraks were slower than expected, making only 4 knots. It would take longer than the allotted 40 minutes to cover the 6,000 yards from the line of departure to the beach. At 3,000 yards, the enemy's big guns began firing. At 2,000 yards, machine guns, snipers, mortars, and beach guns opened up to inflict still more punishment. And now, when pinpoint naval and air support was needed against these positions, the dense smoke and dust raised by the barrage served the enemy as a screen. The first waves of Marines got ashore almost intact, but as the Japanese shook off the effects of the shelling that had been lifted too soon, the later waves would pay dearly.
Those 125 LVTs crossed the reef without a problem, delivered 1,500 Marines on the red beaches in the first 15 minutes with just acceptable casualties. That was great. It was brilliant. The problems came in maintaining the momentum of the assault. Everybody else in the division coming ashore on D-Day had to ride the Higgins boats. These are open craft with a deeper draft. They're not tracked, they're boats. These carrying the rest of the assault waves, carrying the tanks and the artillery pieces, hung up on the reef. They had to unload there. They lost the momentum of the attack and suffered very heavy casualties.
It was in trying to ferry hung-up troops from the reef that the Amtraks returning from the beach would be devastated.
One tractor ahead of us stood out because the men had left it, and after they were gone, 2 Marines started climbing out with their clothing on fire. They stood for a few seconds on the side of the tractor, but as life faded, they fell face down into the water.
Only 35 of 125 Amtraks would survive the battle. The offshore waters were littered with bodies as the ferocity of the Japanese fire literally tore the Marines to bits. 200 feet from the water's edge was a 4-foot seawall of coconut logs. It frustrated the plan to push the Amtraks inland before the Marines disembarked. As always, the best officers and non-coms stood up and led handfuls of the bravest over the barricades and paid the highest price.
Colonel Shoup later described his lines as nothing in a straight line, but like a stock market graph. It was up and down, in and out, sometimes 20 feet deep, sometimes maybe a couple hundred yards.
Worse off than the Marines pinned in the tiny beachhead were those trying to follow the wave of Amtraks in the deeper drafted, unarmored, untracked Higgins boats. Hung up on the reef, and with the failure of the scheme to shuttle them to shore in the first wave Amtraks, the Marines had to wade up to 1,000 yards to the beach in chest-deep water. Soon, the lagoon at Tarawa was running red. In the first hours of the landing at Tarawa, Marines died by the dozens, wading hundreds of yards through the bullet-swept lagoon from Higgins boats that were hung up on the reef.
I know that my orders took into consideration that the boats might not get in, because my orders were to land in the center of the beach, come in by boats as far as we could, and if the tide was high enough to get over, fine. If it wasn't, then wait for the tractors to come back. Our only problem was the tractors weren't going to come back. It wasn't long as we were approaching the reef itself to see that most of the tractors were hit. Some were on fire and they were all stopped, and men were leaving the tractors, some being shot as they got out, and moving into the in towards the beach. I couldn't see the beach because of the smoke and what have you.
From above, a Navy pilot described the scene. The water never seemed clear of tiny men, their rifles over their heads, slowly walking beachward. I wanted to cry. A Navy officer wrote, "They kept falling, singly, in groups, and in rows." Major Henry Crow on Red Beach 3 with his 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines was the only assault battalion commander who got ashore with his men. With leadership separated and with huge losses of officers and non-coms, the situation was a shambles. At the center beach, Red 2, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Amy, was killed trying to land. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jordan, an observer from the newly activated 4th Marine Division, took charge of Amy's forces. With overall command all but shattered, the battle fell into the hands of squads, platoons, and individuals. The training of the United States Marines to fight with valor and initiative, even when reduced to small groups, would pay dividends.
They knew what to expect from combat. They knew that their leaders, their staff NCOs and lieutenants and captains were likely to be early casualties. They trained their men to assume a next level of responsibility or higher.
I think the typical example of an NCO taking over was when I was gathering up men to put on our left. A staff sergeant from the old Corps came up, wounded in the hip, I think, because he was dragging his hip behind him, and he saluted, and he wanted to know what he could do. I told him what I was trying to do. He limped off, grabbed up Marines, and put them in the holes along those sides. And, you know, over the years, I've gotten many salutes, but I really treasure that one.
Colonel Shoup's artillery commander managed to get 75mm pack howitzers ashore on the backs of Marines instead of mules. They did deadly work at point-blank range. As the day wore on, the situation for the Marines pinned close to the beach became desperate.
General Julian C. Smith, commanding the 2nd Marine Division, had an intense problem of getting reinforcements ashore to Shoup after the HR landings. The first to go in was the Regimental Reserve from the 2nd Marines, and that was Major Wood B. Kyles, 1st Battalion, 2nd Marines. There were enough LVTs left over to take 2 of his companies ashore, but the rest of them had to come by boats. They were held up on the reef and, of course, waded in, and they paid the price. They suffered heavy casualties. The next one to come in was part of the Division Reserve under Major Rood. Rood's men tried to land on the left flank, on the left side of the pier on Red Beach 3. By the time Rood came in, no LVTs, all boats having to wade 700 yards, they were shot to pieces.
Only at the northwestern tip of Batio was there success. There, Major Michael Ryan led survivors from the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines ashore after spotting a lone Marine landing through a gap in the Japanese defenses.
We were due to land in the center of the beach, and my executive officer, Obie O'Brien, in the next boat hollered over to me, "Hey, Mike, what do you want to do?" That question, I think, saved a lot of people's lives because it caused me to look around for a different area in which to land. And on the Bird's Beak, on the point, I saw one Marine leaping over the parapet. So I said, "Obie, let's take the boats around that sunken ship and wade in from that point."
Once ashore, Mike Ryan took charge of scattered Marine units and created the only organized fighting force that would be ashore for a day and a half. He had just 200 men and 2 tanks.
The main companies of the 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines were up in the front, and on the side we had men from many units, but I don't know how many. I didn't know what units they were with. They were just put in holes and along that side.
As the battle raged, David Shoup radioed, "Issue in doubt." The last time a Marine had sent those grim words was moments before the fall of Wake Island. In the late afternoon, General Julian Smith ordered the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines under Major Lawrence Hayes to make a near-suicidal diversionary landing to the east of Major Crow, hoping to forestall a Japanese attack on Crow's weak left flank. But due to botched communications, Hayes never received the order to land. To add to the confusion, a pilot mistook artillery units headed for the beach for Hayes reinforcements. Julian Smith now mistakenly believed that Hayes' battalion was ashore, guarding Crow's left flank. On the beach, Marines were so packed together that there wasn't room for foxholes for everyone. The seawall was the only other protection. Why didn't the Japanese attack?
The attack never came. Admiral Shibasaki's wire communications that he could communicate with all of his supporting units were shredded by that preliminary heavy bombardment. He had no way to orchestrate a counterattack for the next 48 hours.
When it was discovered that his reinforcements had not yet landed, Major Hayes was ordered to take his battalion in.
On the morning of D+1, after being boated all night, seasick, wet, scared, here came the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines. They were told to land on Red Beach too. Shoup wanted them to come in close to the pier, come in a column. To hell with trying to make this grand frontal attack across the reef. They didn't get that word. The communications were still bad. And Hayes' men landed on line on the reef. They hit the reef, and Hayes' men died by the hundreds as they waded ashore the morning of D+1.
The morning light revealed more than 50 disabled tanks, Amtraks, and boats in the water on both sides of the pier. The heat was volcanic. The powdery dust seared throats and clogged nostrils. The awful stench of the dead penetrated everywhere from the glut of bodies in the lagoon. Scores of Marines were still in the water, many under attack by Japanese machine guns firing from the rusting hulk of the transport Niminoa. A Navy salvage officer, Lieutenant Eddie Albert, moved to the rescue. His boat was filled with drums of high-octane gasoline.
As I looked around, I saw a lot of men in the water, wounded. So I, with my friend who was at the other end, we tried to pick up the wounded, which we did, and we were being fired on from the Nimono. That ship that had been sunken by the British had about 5 machine gun nests in it, and we were right against it. And the bullets were incendiary and armor piercing, and they came right through the boat and skittering around on the floor. But we found that out a little late, but fortunately somebody was watching over us and the bullet didn't hit any of those tanks of gasoline. There were about a dozen, 10 or 12 tanks of very high test gasoline.
Ironically, while the Marine commanders knew where the battle was going badly, they knew nothing about where it was going well. So when Major Mike Ryan fought his men all the way up the west coast, known as Green Beach, and opened it up for a full battalion landing team to be put ashore, it went unreported.
I think that I contributed to the loss of life in the 8th Marines because I did not make a concerted effort to get the word back to regiment. I had a lot of things on my mind, and we had no immediate radios. But as I look back, I could have done better. I could have passed it, the word, and we'd save a lot of lives in that battalion of the 8th Marines.
Without the flamethrowers or heavy weapons he would need to hold the western beaches for the night, Major Ryan felt compelled to fall back to his original landing position. 24 precious hours would pass before full unit reinforcements would land in the west to assist the battered and bloodied Tarawa Marines. As the Marines battled across Tarawa, the technique for clearing pillboxes and deep emplacements became known as blind 'em, blast 'em, and burn 'em. Withering fire drove the Japanese defenders away from their firing slits, so the demo men could heave explosive charges into the bunkers. Then, flamethrower men would shoot fire through the openings, burning up the oxygen inside and suffocating the defenders. Flamethrowers proved indispensable to the assault. The 72-pound weapon consisted of 3 tanks, 2 of them holding 4 gallons of napalm and 1 with compressed air. If the operator did not lean forward to counterbalance the recoil of air, he could be knocked on his back and incinerated. As for logistics, Admiral Nimitz's order to get in and get out created a near disaster.
That meant willy-nilly unloading the transports as fast as they could, regardless of what the contents of cargo going into the boats. The Marines critically needed specific items. They needed plasma and stretchers and flamethrowers, ammunition and water, particularly water. They couldn't find it. There were 500 boats in the lagoon circling. They had no idea which of those boats contained the critical supplies they needed. This was one of the first changes to amphibious doctrine that came from the Battle of Tarawa. From that point on, the land and force commander, based on the tactical situation ashore, would dictate the level and nature of unloading of the amphibious ships.
As Day 2 wore on and the battle intensified, scenes of violent death were everywhere.
I, for example, saw an Amtrak floating, and I thought I'd better, it was going out to sea. And I remember I turned and went out to see what was going on there, and there were 2 men in it, both burned to a crisp.
The smokeless powder the Japanese used was the envy of the Marines. It made the enemy's fire much harder to pinpoint. Despite the heavy fire, Marines didn't spend much time ducking. Hell, said one, you might duck and run right into another bullet. Although Majors Crow and Rood could not budge the Japanese on their flanks on Red 1, Kyle and Jordan on Red 2 collected themselves and fought to the south coast. Batio had now been cut in two.
The morning of D+1, in 1 brilliant hour, Mike Ryan, with 2 tanks, a handful of troops, and 1 naval gunfire spotter, captured all of the western end of Batio. That cleared Green Beach, and that meant, for the first time, General Julian C. Smith could land a reinforcing unit with full unit integrity and with all of its weapons.
This time, the top commanders found out about it. David Shoup was encouraged enough to say in his legendary situation report, "Casualties many, percentage dead unknown, combat efficiency, we are winning." Some of the Marines refused Eddie Albert's offer to evacuate them in his boatload of wounded.
And they said, "Are you coming back?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, bring some rifle. And they'd lost all their equipment. And they refused to get in my boat. So I dropped off the wounded and came back. By that time, they'd all been killed.
On the evening of Day 2, Major William K. Jones, 1st Battalion, 6th Marines landed from rubber rafts on Green Beach, at the western end of the island. Not one of Jones's reinforcements was lost as Mike Ryan's makeshift outfit held the Japanese down. Jones's battalion had 28 hours of vicious fighting ahead as it moved in a routing out operation along the south coast, which the Japanese had fortified even more heavily than the north, where the main landings had hit. Although there were only a handful of Marine tanks ashore, their contribution was outsized. When Marines took fire from a pillbox, the tanks moved up to the firing slit and blasted away, point blank.
But in order to do that, they had to find out where there were guns. And they did that by a kid just getting out in front of the machine and draw the fire. And it was a ticket to death immediately.
Snipers were everywhere. When one slowed the advance, Colonel Shoup shouted at his troops, "Take cover, then move up and kill the bastard." And they did. Not all of the miseries came from ordnance. A correspondent wrote of a kind of skin-cracking heat that was as sharp as a physical blow on the head. Another wrote, a cloying powder caked the eyes and nostrils and made breathing difficult. Marine breakouts were occurring all over the island now. The lagoon coasts were cleared in bitter fighting. Major Bill Jones continued leading his 1st Battalion, 6th Marines along Baicio's south coast, meeting strong fortifications and heavy casualties. Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth McLeod's 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines also landed in the west. They moved through Mike Ryan's positions to aid Bill Jones in the mop-up of Baicio's eastern tail. Ray Murray's 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines would later clear the outer islands in a series of hard fights. The most effective naval gun support came after the troops had landed. Special teams called the shots for the ships lying offshore. Mike Ryan would fondly remember the mysteriously appearing naval artillery spotter he knew only as Lieutenant Green.
I don't know where Lieutenant Green came from, but he controlled the naval gunfire on that beach. He certainly knew his naval gunfire, and it was his work, and then Ed Bale's tanks that really turned the tide for us.
Marines in their first combat learned that in battle, death is as normal as life. Men adjust to it. Even the most vicious fighting can be done with a calm, clear head. It soon became obvious that the Japanese had decided not to fight inland, preferring an all-or-nothing stand near the beaches. Fighters of remarkable bravery, some Japanese killed themselves with rifles and grenades rather than surrender their honor. The Japanese were so deeply dug in that some Marines fought for days without ever sighting their enemy. Admiral Shibasaki could see that his garrison was doomed. He radioed a last gallant message. "Our weapons have been destroyed, and from now on, everyone is attempting a final charge. May Japan exist for 1,000 years." On the evening of D+2, to cries of "Japanese drink Marines' blood," banzai charges hit Baicio's eastern end.
I had formed up a jerry-rigged reserve to commit to the battle in case they broke through, which they did, and which I had to commit, which drove them out at bayonet and grenade, rifle, anything they could use into back to their lines. And they decided to make the all-out attack early in the morning of the next day.
As the battle raged in the darkness, naval gunfire supported Bill Jones's action, the shells falling to within 500 yards of his lines. Supporting Marine artillery fire fell even closer.
So everyone got into the fight. It was a madhouse, but we did repulse them.
Tarawa to the Japanese is probably like our Alamo. Their defenders fought gallantly and with great ferocity to the last man, just about, for something they believed in.
The banzai attacks only hastened the end for the Japanese, as they lost 325 men. But they took with them 173 United States Marines. On the third day of the battle, the Marines on Tarawa continued to seek out and neutralize the hundreds of Japanese emplacements still offering resistance. Those of the enemy who would not surrender were entombed in their bunkers. Admiral Shibasaki died in his command bunker when Marines poured gasoline through the ventilators and then set it off.
Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth McLeod's 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines landed on Green Beach and moved eastward behind Jones, eventually taking over the lead of the spearhead on the 4th morning to secure the eastern end of the island.
The mop-up fighting would continue. But the issue had already been decided. Suddenly, the overwhelming presence of the dead seemed to outweigh the exhausted living.
I still stayed there and got my boat back and was picking up the dead out of the water. In that heat, they float very, very quickly in the warm water. And so I picked him up and took him for proper burial.
The tide had come in, and the dead were now afloat in a swamp of bodies. The survivors realized that if the tide had not been exceptionally low, they would have had no cover at the seawall against the defensive firestorm. Correspondent Richard Johnson wrote, "The smell was inescapable. It was everywhere, and it was not the kind of smell one gets accustomed to. It suffused the Marines' hair, their clothing, and seemed to adhere to their bodies. They smelled it for weeks after the battle, and like all pungent odors, it evoked instant and nightmarish memories."
The 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines passed through us, and I had a chance to walk the lines in front of my front lines, and tears came to my eyes because of all the dead Marines mingled with dead Japanese that had been in this terrific counterattack.
4 Navy doctors and 85 hospital corpsmen had been killed or wounded in the battle. For every Marine who died, 4 Japanese joined him. The proportion of Marine dead to wounded was dismal. For every 3 men hit, 1 had been killed. But if the lessons were expensive, they taught much. Batio was secured at 13:12 hours on the 4th day. It had been 75 hours and 42 minutes since the Marines had hit the beach.
One factor in this battle that's always appealed to me was the proof that came out of the Tarawa battle. See, the war was 2 years old, almost by the time of this battle. And we hadn't had a great deal of close-up combat. Reports on American infantry performance were not very encouraging. There was the question, do Americans still have it or not? With these things in mind, you can see how Tarawa came as a great shock and a great relief at the same time, because if we ever fought a battle in which courage was a dominant factor, it was at Tarawa.
The battle would reward its heroes. Colonel David Shoup, who received a Medal of Honor, would rise to become Commandant of the Marine Corps. For William Hawkins, Alexander Bonnyman, and William Bordelon, their Medals of Honor cost them their lives. Merritt Edson would be promoted over 100 senior colonels. Other stories would end less well.
About D+3, I was walking along the beach, and I came across 15 dead Marines, all in a group. They were being gathered up by their comrades. 2 of the men were named Montague and Singh. But I learned that these 2 Marines had grown up together in Texas. They had gone to school together. They enlisted in the Marine Corps together a year and a half or so before the Tarawa battle. And they died together on the beach at Tarawa as they were landing with the rest of their platoon. Very sad story.
The mistakes were reviewed as the planners resolved to cut the human cost of future battles.
We realized that naval gunfire support needed to be much more pinpoint and deliberate. Instead of just saturating the place with area fire for a couple of hours, we had to take our time and to mark our targets and to do it one by one. We learned that close air support needed better coordination. We needed underwater demolition teams, frogmen, that could go in and determine the obstacles in the water. We needed better tactical communications. All of these things came into place, By the time we invaded the Marshalls 10 weeks later, it was beautiful.
In their months of action on Guadalcanal, the 2nd Marines had lost 263 men. At Tarawa, 35% of the regiment was killed. In the 2nd Marine Division, 60 Marine and 2 Navy officers died, along with 1,025 Marine and 28 Navy enlisted men. There were 2,292 American wounded. Only half the dead were identified. Just 1 dead Marine in 4 was returned to his native soil. The enemy lost 4,690 men. Only 17 Japanese were captured, along with 129 Korean laborers. Navy construction battalions buried the last of the Japanese defensive positions, while the Seabees prepared 5 separate cemeteries. They also put the finishing touches on the airstrip, one that the bombarding planes and ships had carefully avoided during the battle. Planes began landing on it immediately. With land-based air cover in place, the naval force could now move to open and safer waters. After the battle, Colonel Merritt Edson put it bluntly and boldly to an American home front profoundly shocked by the shattering losses. He said of the Japanese, "They don't believe we can take it. They're willing to accept large losses in the hope that we will be ready to quit before we can lick them." None of Japan's warriors returned home from Tarawa to carry the word that fighting against United States Marines and sailors would prove that belief to be a vain one.